Giving thanks has always been a cornerstone of Christianity and the Christian life. In fact, one of America's favorite holidays was itself started because of the religious piety of the Christian pilgrims, who, in spite of great suffering and death during their first 18 months in America, nonetheless saw God's goodness and were determined to thank God, their Creator, with a special feast, what we today call Thanksgiving. In one of the letters Paul wrote to the early Christian church, Paul also affirmed this virtue of giving thanks. He said this, he says, "Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you." And this is just one of many verses and commands from God to us, his people, to be people of thanksgiving, to be people of gratitude. Yet within our country, though Thanksgiving was a very religious and God-centered holiday, over the past 150 years or so, American and Western society has been moving away from a belief in God and moving even further away from an adherence or obedience to God's commands upon our lives. Many people say, I believe in God, but the obedience to God and what he says to do is even further foreign, more foreign and further distant from the norm. And yet, in spite of our increasingly secularized society, an amazing thing has taken place over the same period of time. With the growth and expansion of behavioral science, focusing for the first time in history on people's quality of life, productivity, and fulfillment, life was too hard before to do scientific studies on those topics. That's how blessed a world we live in. We can actually have science focus on quality of life, productivity, and personal fulfillment. Science and the innumerable studies therein are proving over and over the power and positive impact of gratitude in the life of people who practice it. And inversely, the deficiencies in the lives of those who don't. Now, this is no longer just a Christian teaching, but is something the secular world believes and promotes. In fact, if you get on YouTube and you punch in the power of gratitude, most of the videos are not Christian in their origin, but come from secular persons who have recognized the value and virtue of thanksgiving and gratitude. People who don't even believe in God or recognize him as a creator and giver of all that is good, as we Christians do, testify to the power and positive impact of a person giving thanks each day for the blessings of life that they have achieved or received. Now, my question is this: giving thanks to who? They don't say, and they don't seem to think it's all that important. The very act of doing it, just the action of gratitude, harnesses the power that gratitude has to offer an individual. And this is what we'll be talking about this morning in message number 2 of our current series called God's Playlist. Now, raise your hand if you have some kind of music playlist on some kind of music device. Raise your hand. I want to see. Okay, a lot of us do. I love it. You used to have to burn CDs with your favorite songs. I mean, technology. It's made music listening wonderful. Last week, Matt talked about his the playlist he keeps on Spotify. Many people I know like to use Pandora. Personally, and I guess I'm kind of a dinosaur in this, I still use the old faithful iTunes. Am I a little passé with the iTunes? Yeah, Keegan affirms that. But I'm okay with that. I'm even more passé because I'm not ashamed to admit that you will find a Neil Diamond playlist in my iTunes playlist. Yes. Now I have a question. Does that surprise you? Do I look like a Neil Diamond guy? I do. First service said no. And again, is that a compliment or is that an insult? I'm not sure. But it shouldn't surprise you because we all love Sweet Caroline, don't we? And for those of you that don't know, that is my eldest daughter, Caroline. In fact, when she was born, I had a video camera back in the day because we didn't have our phones, and everybody who visited had to sing one chorus of Sweet Caroline over, and we have about 30 minutes of one verse of Sweet Caroline over and over if you wanted to come see us and our new baby girl. But I digress. But as far as playlists go, God has a playlist too. But God keeps his playlist here in the Bible. And the greatest concentration of God's playlist is somewhere in the middle of the Bible, right here in a book called Psalms. It is filled with songs, poems, passionate writings, and artistic compositions, a total of 150 of them. And God's big old playlist includes, among many other types of songs, songs of gratitude. So what is gratitude? Well, most of us understand it's a pretty basic term. We learned it when we were really young. But gratitude is this. It's the quality of being thankful, readiness to show appreciation for, and to return kindness. It is a thing that many parents, as I said, first teach their child to say. You learn, if I'm going to give you something, what do you got to say? Please. And then once I give it to you, what do you have to say back to me? Thank you. Yes, I love it. I heard some kid voices. I think that might have been my kid voices back there. Well done, children. We've trained you well. But why do we do that? Why is it so important? Why is this thank you? Why is this gratitude such a quintessential component to life? Why do we teach it to our young? Is it strictly for politeness? Do we simply want to raise polite kids? For some, that might be it. It might be for social acceptance. We want our kid to be liked and to be nice and to be well adjusted in the environment they go to. Some children might learn about it and do it to manipulate it. I get one cookie, I say thank you. If I say thank you a lot, maybe I get a second cookie. Do any of you have those kids who will gin up the thank yous to try to get the follow-up cookie? Well, the most important, or one of the most important reasons why gratitude and the thank yous are important is that we want to teach our children to say thank you because developing an attitude of gratitude within them is one of the most important things that we need to do in life. Gratitude does not come naturally. It's something we must be taught. It's something that must be trained, and we know the earlier you start training somebody to do something, the easier it is. See, gratitude and giving thanks does something really important to the human person, to humanity on a whole. It keeps our appetites in check. You and I, when we want something naturally and we enjoy it, what do we want to do? We want to get more of it, and more of it, and more of it. And the process of exercising gratitude, of being grateful, of saying thank you, it does something. It puts a little check on this consuming machine and makes us recognize that what we have received came from someone or somewhere, and that it was not completely of our own doing or ability to acquire. And this is really important because it forces us to consider somebody other than ourselves in the acquisition process. Now, more directly for Christians, when we are grateful and when we profess thanksgiving in our lives, we are acknowledging and recognizing not just that they came from somewhere or something, but we are recognizing God in that moment. Now, whether we receive something directly from God or from somebody else who was his gift to us in giving that, it nonetheless came from God. And as followers of Jesus, the Bible very clearly directs us where the gifts that we experience in our life come from. In James 1, 16 and 17. If you don't know this verse, I encourage you to write it down and to memorize it. Because this is a theological verse of great importance. It says this: "Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers." Interesting that deception is at play when we think otherwise. "Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change." God is the giver of every good gift, every blessing, every moment of joy and happiness. God is the ultimate author. Those friends and family members who we love so much, who we treasure, they're his gift. The health and life that you and I possess this morning, that's his gift. Not your exercise regimen that you do each and every day, that is his gift too, to help you receive the gift of health that you have today. Just like the secular world, behavioral science, leadership and life coaches, we Christians agree with the power of gratitude. However, when we are grateful, we acknowledge not just the gift, but we also acknowledge, even more importantly, the giver. Doing this increases our faith in God. It increases our affection for God. It also increases the frequency with which we talk to God. We think about him. We remember him throughout our day. Gratitude is so important to the life of any individual, but especially to the life of the person who professes faith and follows Jesus Christ. And it's for these reasons that God has included songs of gratitude in his playlist. And we're going to look at one of those songs this morning. We'll be reading and studying out of the book of Psalms in the chapter Psalm 116. Now this chapter is 19 verses long, and it's kind of lengthy. We're going to read the whole thing. We won't be able to cover every part of it. But join me now as I read. You can follow in the screen above if you have your Bible or your apps. Feel free to follow along there. But I will read the 19 verses from Psalm 116. I love the Lord, for he heard my voice. He heard my cry for mercy. Because he turned his ear to me, I will call on him as long as I live. The cords of death entangled me. The anguish of the grave came over me. I was overcome by distress and sorrow. Then I called on the name of the Lord. Lord, save me. The Lord is gracious and righteous. Our God is full of compassion. The Lord protects the unwary. When I was brought low, he saved me. Return to your rest, my soul, for the Lord has been good to you. For you, Lord, have delivered me from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling, that I may walk before the Lord in the land of the living. I trusted in the Lord when I said, I am greatly afflicted. In my alarm, I said, everyone is a liar. What shall I return to the Lord for all his goodness to me? I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants. Truly, I am your servant, Lord. I serve you just as my mother did. You have freed me from my chains. I will sacrifice a thank offering to you and call on the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. In the courts of the house of the Lord, in your midst, Jerusalem, praise the Lord. Now, unfortunately, as I said, there's a lot here, and we're not able to look at every verse. But the author of this psalm of thanksgiving, this song of gratitude, provides us some important and insightful instruction about giving thanks. If you remember from last week, Matt taught a psalm about praise to God. And while in this chapter we read a lot of stuff that sounds like praise, when the experts divide up the psalms into different categories, this is a different genre than praise. And what makes it different is that this psalm talks about the author's experience of suffering and struggling and being delivered from that. Many psalms speak of the glory and the greatness of God, but this psalm speaks of the author's difficulty, almost to the point of death, and yet talks about God, how God has delivered. Was it sickness? We don't know for sure. Was he wounded in some serious way? We can't tell. He does mention death. What was it that caused him to say these things? Well, we look in verse 3 and we see this. The cords of death entangled me. The anguish of the grave came over me. I was overcome by distress and sorrow. In verse 8, he makes a similar statement when he says this, for you, Lord, have delivered me from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. And again at the end of verse 16, he says this to the Lord, you have freed me from my chains. Now, these aren't just affirming words and generic proclamations being made. The author, in some capacity, and maybe in many ways, has suffered, has experienced great suffering, and he's been delivered. And I was thinking about this, I thought, who else has been in trouble? Who else has been in trouble? Who else has faced suffering at points in their lives? You have. I have. All kinds of trouble at any point in our life, whether when we were young, some kind of loss, some kind of sickness. We've all had our backs up against the wall. We've all been at some point this close to going down in any number of ways. I have, you have. And this leads us to our first point this morning, is that we all can identify with the author in having suffered because God has delivered us. The very fact that you are sitting here in relative peace, though you might have struggles ongoing in your life today, is proof that God has delivered you at some point prior in your life from a tumultuous situation. And I would bet many, many different perilous and difficult situations. God has delivered us. He has rescued us. Throughout our lives, each of us have found ourselves in dangerous and troublesome spots, or more likely, we've gotten ourselves in dangerous and troublesome places. Sometimes through our own foolishness and our impulsiveness. At other times, life just took a wrong turn and trouble found us. However we got there, though, there was a terrible place. And we too, like the author of Psalm 116, found ourselves in a relative amount of suffering and trouble. And then we were rescued. Our troubles went away. We can't explain it. The difficulty I was facing went away. The impending firing from my boss didn't happen. The financial calamity that was coming my way, I got this raise at work. Any number of difficulties and struggles we find ourselves in, and I just scratched the surface. All of a sudden, things happened that delivered us and rescued us from that place. Sometimes it happened quickly, sometimes it happened more slowly, but they went away. You and I were staring down the barrel of a metaphorical loaded gun, and the gun disappeared. It's happened to all of us at some, if not multiple, points throughout our lives. As I was studying this week, this was the thing that shocked me the most. I've forgotten all the trouble that I got myself into that God got me out of. I mean, He really did. I have made some boneheaded decisions. I've created some terrible circumstances in my life that I've had to deal with. I've had circumstances impose themselves on me that I wasn't sure how I was going to get out of or what was going to happen to it. And whether it was in the moment or over time, all of a sudden, they just happened to be gone, and I'm living my life, and I forgot that they had ever been there. All of us have gone through this. Now, one example that's come to mind of late, and this is because our oldest child, David, turned 15, and he got his permit. So, of course, you get the dad talks, don't do anything that I wouldn't do, but my talks are actually don't do the things that I did. So when I turned 16, the very first day I turned 16 and I got my license, I asked Mom if I could borrow her car because I didn't have a car. And of course, my mom said yes, because she's always said yes when I asked her for things. But that's a whole nother story, another issue. Anyway, I got her car, got her keys, and drove over to my friend Phil's house. And he and I decided we're going to race on the back roads of North Macomb County. We thought that would be a good thing to do. So we get in our cars and we head out and we start going. We're on some back road and we think we're good. There's no traffic and we're using both lanes. I mean, we're doing it Fast and Furious style, right? So anyway, what they were doing in that area of the county is they were putting through a new freeway, a bypass. And when you have gravel trucks coming through, in and out, they do something to the road. And what is that? Dirt and sand all over. And we were coming up, and I needed to make a left-hand turn, and I just pulled ahead of Phil. And I didn't slow down nearly as I should have slowed down, and I tried to make this left-hand turn, and the car just kept on sliding. Now, we're out in the country, and ditches are 6 to 8 feet deep, and there's not much shoulder. And the turn, I need to turn this way. The road goes this way. I need to turn this way, and there's a ditch that goes this way. And I go to turn, but the car doesn't turn, and it just begins to slide. And just like you would see in the movie, the rear driver's side and the front passenger car cling to the edge of the ditch. And the car leans forward and starts rocking like this. And I'm in the front seat like this. And I think, don't move. Now, in the movies, it's a cliff and it's really bad. There's a 6-foot drop here. But that car is not going to survive that 6-foot drop very well regardless. And so I slowly, as you see in the movies, ease my way to the back seat and try not to put the weight on the front. And I managed to open the back door, and I managed to get out, and there is Phil standing next to me looking like this. And I looked to him like, what do I do? What can I do? And there's a gas station a couple miles away, and so I said, hey, let's go try the gas station. Maybe they got a wrecker there. Maybe they can come. Lo and behold, pay the guy $20. The wrecker comes out, pulls me out. Car's fine as far as I know, and we go on our way. Well, being the man of integrity that I am and honesty, when I was 22 years old, I sat my mom down and I told her the story of what I did with her car the first day. I felt pretty bold at that point. My point is, I deserve for that car to go in the ditch. My family didn't deserve it because we couldn't afford a new car or the repairs to the car had I put it there. And God was gracious. And that was just one of many situations. Now, presently, while I don't have as many car in the ditch stories as I used to, because it seems those rescuing things often happen when we're younger a lot more, at least the ones that we cause. Youth tends to encourage us in that direction. We have other stories. Cancer, the death of someone very close to us, betrayal and abandonment in a relationship, financial struggle that we just think is impossible to overcome. And I could go on and on. And yet God has delivered so many of us from so many of these different struggles here today. Now, God has not rescued us from every trouble that we've faced, but He has rescued us out of many places that would have caused us great harm. And for some of us, He rescued us out of places that did cause us great harm. Some of us, however, are still in trouble and peril, even as you sit here today. And you know what? There's a psalm for you, but it's a different genre, so come back in the coming weeks, and I'm sure Matt will give it to you. But for the time being, even as we're here, even as we have our present struggles, if we look back, we can see that God has faithfully delivered us and rescued us from previous struggles. And so whatever struggle we're facing now, how should we think differently than knowing what we've experienced in the past? God has delivered us. And this then leads us into our second point. And our second point this morning can be found in verse 1, and it's this. God has delivered us, but He hasn't just delivered us. God hears us. If you look at verse 1 and 2 of Psalm 116, the author says this, I love the Lord, for He heard my voice. He heard my cry for mercy. Because He turned His ear to me, I will call on Him as long as I live. Have you ever been ignored? Did you ever have a very important and meaningful relationship in your life? Parent, spouse, sibling, dear friend, where all of a sudden they just began, or more and more they began to ignore you, pretend like you didn't exist, talk to you in any way? It's devastating. In fact, there are people who would much rather take physical harm and physical suffering than go through the emotional suffering of being isolated and ignored, of not being heard. God is not some superhero who flies in, rescues us, and flies back off to the ice fortress up in the North Pole. That's not how God works. God does deliver us, but He's not a superhero. He's our Father. He's our good, good Father. And as a father, He wants to have relationship with us. He wants to, before He rescues us, He wants to hear us. He wants us to know that we matter, that what we say is valuable, that we have worth. One of the aspects of relationships, marriage or otherwise, is showing love for each other. You can tell somebody that you love them. Those are easy things to say in many cases, not all, in many. But you know, you really show someone you love them? You listen to them. You ask a question, and then you be quiet, and you let them talk. You affirm their value by your willingness to sit and to hear whatever it is that they have to and want to say. That's how the most effective way in many cases to show someone love. Not gifts, not big stuff, listening. God made it this way. And God, knowing this, what does He do? The very first verse in this psalm, He brings this out. He says, I love the Lord, for He heard my voice. I love God because He has shown me His love by hearing me. When you and I are in trouble, when we've cried out to God, I've been in I don't know how many situations I can think of. I could name you 3 or 4 right offhand when I couldn't help myself and I prayed, God, please, please, please help me now. I'm in so much trouble. This is going to go so badly. And what happened? He heard me. And then he delivered me. This is who our God is. He rescues us, but he hears us. He connects with us. He loves us in the hearing. There's a great story in the Old Testament about God hearing. It's Elijah on Mount Carmel. It's found in 1 Kings 18. I'm going to paraphrase it so that we can move through it more quickly. But Elijah is the only, as far as he knows, there's a couple others that are being preserved by God on the side. But as far as Elijah knows, he's the last faithful God follower in Israel at this time. And everybody else in Israel has gone the way of these pagan gods and their priests. And there's this face-off on Mount Carmel about whose God is supreme. And the pagan gods, of which there are almost 1,000, start first. And they start dancing and chanting and praying and doing all this crazy stuff. They start yelling. As the day goes on and there's nothing from them, they start cutting themselves. Elijah, being the competitor he is, evidently, he starts trash talking them. He says, maybe your God is sleeping. Maybe your God is going to the bathroom. He really does say going to the bathroom. He says it in Hebrew terms, whatever those would be, relieving himself, whatever. He's taunting them. But at the end of the day, their gods never respond. Why? Because they did not hear. They could not hear him. And then Elijah, at the end of this long thing that the other priests went through, he simply gets down on his knees. And in a matter of a few sentences, he says, Lord, hear my prayer. Respond to this request for your power to come down, that the people might know that you alone are God. And what does God do? He hears the prayer of his servant, and fire falls from heaven. And Elijah and the Lord win the day. It isn't enough for God just to deliver us. He wants to love us and to hear us. And so your cries to God, every one of them are heard. Not everyone is answered in the moment, but every one is heard. Do not forget that. And that leads us to our third and final point, and it's this, and it's found in verse 7. We forget, as I said earlier, and the author knows we forget, and so he says this. Verse 7, return to your rest, my soul, for the Lord has been good to you. He delivered us. He hears us. We must remind ourselves of this. We must remind ourselves of God's deliverance and the fact that he does hear our prayers, because our default is not towards God, it's away from God. Our default is not to remember all the great things that God does, is to focus on the thing right now that I don't have. That's our default. That's where we naturally are inclined to go. And the author knows this. And he talks to himself. He talks to his soul. And I don't think these are just artsy, poetic words that he's putting in the psalm. I think he knows and understands the human condition. Do any of you talk to yourself here quietly without people knowing? Yeah, I get caught every now and then. I'll be in the office thinking through something. Heather go, what was that? Oh, nothing. Nothing at all. But I do it. Or how many of us in a situation where we're afraid, okay, come on, Jeremy, you can do this. You can do this. You have nothing to fear. That's what the psalmist is saying. He's telling us we need to remind ourselves. When it doesn't feel like it, when the circumstances around us don't show it, when the opposition forces us to feel nothing other than running and retreating, and all we have is a thought, stand pat, but nothing feels like standing pat, it's in that moment that we must remind ourselves, God has delivered me in the past. God has heard my cry. I can trust him now. And this is so important. It's so important for all of us, because none of us naturally remembers the activity of God in our life. We forget. As I said, that was one of the most shocking things about my week, is all the things that God has done that I've forgotten. The psalmist talks to himself. He coaches himself on what to do. Return to your rest, my soul. These aren't just flowery words. These are instruction to us to how to recapture the truth of God's faithfulness to us. So this morning, I hope we have a better understanding of the importance of gratitude and the Thanksgiving Psalms that we read, especially on the deliverance piece. Now, I don't have an insert like Matt had from last week, but I want to give you a challenge this week. I want to encourage you to take some time and to remember the crazy spots that you have found yourself in your life previously, and then think about how you were delivered. Whether or not you recognized God being there, the visible or invisible hand of God was there to pull you through. I think you'll be surprised and encouraged as I was as I did this exercise as well. Let me pray.